Well, good evening, and thank you for your welcome to the filling station. It's great to be with you tonight. Now, I'm actually going to start this evening by taking a look at a couple of plants. Let me introduce you to them. Now, this first one is called a sempervivum, or house leek. Sempervivum means ever living. Bit ambitious for me in any garden, and they were called house leeks because people would grow them on the roofs of their houses, supposedly to bring good luck on the house. A house leek. And this one is called a tree house leek, or an aeonium. You can see the reason it's called the tree house leek because it has this big long stem, a bit like a tree trunk underneath. But you know what makes this one really unusual is that I grew it from a cutting. I took a cutting from the mother plant, took two in fact. It did kill the mother plant, but both of the cuttings are thriving. Now, for someone who has always been deaf to plants and completely immune to the joys of gardening, that's really quite something. Now, for me, that's a really unusual way to start any kind of talk. For most of my life, I have, quite frankly, detested gardening. But that has all changed. And I want to tell you some of the reasons it's changed as we go through together. And as I do so, I'm going to illustrate most of it from this book, Tales from an Under Gardener, which I brought out just in November of last year. So let me tell you a bit about how all of this happened. And wherever I can, I will illustrate it from the book. So I'm going to start at the very beginning with a little piece from here called The Dreaded Bench. Here we go. The bench had been a Christmas present some years ago, and on moving day we had placed it under a pergola at the bottom of the garden. The intention was that when summer came, we would sit on it together to enjoy the setting sun. It never happened. Fiona got too sick to leave the house except for vital things, and the bench was forgotten. Now I looked at it, a widower, and sighed as I saw the weeds growing up and over and through it. They seemed to me like a symbol of all the stolen years and failed plans. This bench was not to be sat upon, ever, they seemed to say. The view to right and left wasn't much better either. To one side was a bed of brambles and weeds stretching across to a shed and the fence at the bottom of the garden. To the other, swaying weeds were brushing at the base of my washing line. I felt ashamed that a garden on which teams of volunteers from the church had worked for mine and Fiona's arrival 2 years before had been allowed to fall into such neglect. It all felt like a three-dimensional reflection of my own emotional state. A garden should be a space to breathe and enjoy a brush with nature. Mine was more inclined to suffocate with a reminder of what might have been, but was not. But I decided to do something about it. With the advice of some friends who gave me some simple ideas on where to start, that's exactly what I did. I got started on one of the beds. I cleared the brambles, hacked away at them, took them off at the base, dug the roots out, found myself some spare empty ground where I could plant something, and straight away went away and planted the only thing I could think of because it was the only thing I had ever grown successfully before. It was heathers. They didn't do well. It was the wrong kind of place and the wrong kind of soil and the wrong amount of light, and they really didn't thrive. I did manage to pull them back from the brink a little bit by watering them with very diluted white vinegar because it added to the acid in the soil. But basically, they were the wrong plants in the wrong place. And you know, this was one of many spiritual lessons that I have learned through this whole experience of gardening. Listen, friends, very often we are habitually lazy when planting and growing the kingdom, relying on what has been and what has worked in the past, rather than looking ahead to what might be and asking some more questions. But anyway, I had got started. I'd started to do this thing. I'd started to get involved with this patch of ground around the house. And to my complete astonishment, I was enjoying it. It was doing me all kinds of good. I was sleeping better. I was feeling better about life. I was finding that the gnawing edge of loneliness was actually starting to dissipate a little bit. All of this was completely new to me. And I sat down one day with a friend who is a very experienced counsellor, not a Christian, but a very experienced counsellor, and with the enthusiasm of someone who's new to a hobby, I was pouring all of this out to her about how much good it was doing me, physically and mentally especially. And she nodded sagely over her cup of coffee, and she said, "Oh, well, it's ecotherapy. That's why it can be socially prescribed, because all these things you're talking about are recognised." Once I started to dig into it, sorry, no pun intended, I realised that whole strand of it being good for us goes far back beyond when we first started talking about social prescribing. Way back in the 19th century, it was found that people living in the sanatoria, the residential hospitals, there was a great difference between those who had to pay for their care and those who couldn't afford to pay and therefore had to work in the hospital grounds. It was ones who worked in the grounds who fared better because of their interaction with the natural world around about them. So yes, it was ecotherapy, but for me, it was eco-theology too. I was starting to feel all those things which I had been saying for years. Theological convictions about creation and stewardship and partnership with God, things I knew and believed and had preached from the pulpit for year upon year, now I was starting to really feel them. Those theological convictions were getting ingrained along with the dirt in my fingernails. They were getting engraved on my arms along with the scratches from the brambles as I went along. This was all something new to me. Let me give you some examples of how these theological convictions have come home to roost through this whole experience of gardening. One of them would be a whole idea of partnership. Listen, I've spent years banging on from the pulpit about stewardship and partnership and how we work with God. And of course I believed that, always believed it. But I'm really feeling it now. This whole concept of our partnership with God. I've had one or two people on radio interviews ask me why this book is called Tales from an Undergardener. Well, there are two reasons for that. One is that the undergardener was always just about the lowest possible person in the pecking order of a great household, and that seemed appropriate to me. But also because really, truly, I'm not the gardener. God is. God is the one who takes brown seeds and brown roots and green stems and turns them into every colour and fragrance under the sun. He's the real gardener. I just get to help him. And that idea has been reinforced to me again and again. Let me tell you the story of my Virginia creeper. Now, a couple of years ago, I had my decking replaced at the house where I live because, frankly, it was swaying like a ship on an ocean and it wasn't safe. So we replaced it, and there was some spare timber left over, so the guys who'd built me some planters, 3 of them. So in the ones to right and left, I planted heuchera and ivy that all tumbled over the edge. It looked really good. But in the middle, I had my heart set on a Virginia creeper. So I went to my local nursery, I explained this is what I was looking for, and the nurseryman disappeared off for what felt like ages. Eventually, he came back with what could charitably be described as a twig. That's all it looked like. But he said, he said, sucking his teeth, it's got lovely roots. Well, I had to take his word for it. So I planted it, and I waited, and I waited, and I waited. And a few months later, some tiny, tiny pinpricks of red began to appear. They were the first signs of the buds that were to come. That Virginia creeper is now about 8 metres across, and every autumn it has this wonderful cascade of crimson and orange leaves. There's the partnership, you see. All I did was to plant it and occasionally water it and keep the squirrels from eating it. But God does the clever stuff and he makes it grow. This is a lesson that comes home to me again and again in the garden. Now listen, I am so inexperienced with all of this, I really shouldn't do it. I really should not do it, but I can't help myself. Whenever I go to a garden centre, I get drawn to what I call the hospital shelf. You know what I mean? The place where they put the plants that have been a bit neglected or damaged and they're sort of on their last legs. And I was drawn to this little Acer tree. It's called Orange Dream. It has a lovely papery grey-green bark and in the autumn has these beautiful yellow and orange leaves. And it was really in a very sorry state. But I decided I would try and do something about it. Let me read to you from the book. All of my rescue plants to date have been small and unassuming. However, when I saw a beautiful Acer on the hospital shelf, my heart was drawn to it. Some of the branches had been snapped through careless handling or wind damage. There were only a few tiny leaves clinging to it here and there. Those leaves, though, were already showing the delicate edges and range of colours for which these Japanese maples are famous. The undamaged stems had beautiful grey-green bark, and I felt there was still hope. To date, that hope is still alive. I brought it home, soaked it in water overnight, and trimmed back the most damaged branches. I then planted it in a well-drained pot, fed it with some very diluted plant food, and waited. Now, the pot is in a spot which is sheltered from the wind, but which gets a good few hours of sunshine every day. More importantly, though, it's near the back door. I cannot go into the garden without passing by my little injured Acer plant. Now, I'm sure that my attention in itself can do nothing to make it thrive, but I choose to believe that it helps. Actually, that's not quite true. I am sure that my attention does nothing to help the plant, but it does a lot to help me. Gardening has affected the plot of land surrounding my house, of course. However, the impact on the person tending it has been greater still. I have always enjoyed God's creation and have been known to preach sermons on it, especially at harvest time. Now, though, it's personal. The big theology of creation and redemption is writ small in my little potted tree. An arc of theology which stretches far too wide and high above my head for me to focus upon it has come into sharp relief in the confines of this little pot. You see, I'm learning something about partnership. I'm learning something about timing too. If ever you were to choose a passage about timing in the whole of Scriptures, I suspect it would be this one, Ecclesiastes 3. There is a time for everything. A season for every activity under the heavens, a time to be born and a time to die. A time to plant and a time to uproot. A time to kill and a time to heal. A time to tear down and a time to build. A time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn, and a time to dance. You know, a bit like stewardship and partnership. I know we believe all this stuff, but do we really feel it? Again, I'm starting to feel it now as never before. My involvement with the natural world right outside my doorstep is attuning me to that whole idea of timing. Again, a little quote for you. Autumn is nearly at an end. It is the last week of November, and the weather alternates between days of beguilingly warm sunshine and days of bitter cold. It is as if the season is reluctant to leave and be on her way. Today I have been in the garden working under a frowning leaden sky. The last of the leaves have been raked up and packed down into their enclosure to break down for next year's leaf mould. The last proud stems of dahlia have been trimmed down to a few centimetres above the ground and are tucked into a bed of warming protective mulch. The last struggling begonias, blackened now by early frost, have gone into the compost, and their planters are left lopsided now, with ivy trailing from just one end. Flower beds to left and right have been lightly weeded and nestle now under a blanket of dark bark chippings to shut out the light and warm the soil until warmer days should come. And that is just the point. Those warmer days will come. I've always known it to be true, of course. From early childhood, we learn that the seasons turn, and that winter with trees and presents is followed by spring with Easter eggs, and summer with holidays and water fights, and then back to autumn with piles of leaves to kick and conkers to collect. That particular clock ticks and tocks inside each of us. My time in the garden has changed two things about it, though. The first is that I hear it more loudly. Invested as I am in the things which I have planted, I look out at the signs of the seasons changing with new eyes. I look to see when the autumn winds get stronger and tie the climbers in on the fences. As they get stronger still, potted plants with taller stems get moved closer to the house in the protective shelter of it. When the first frosts come, I notice it not just because I don my dreaded hat for walking the dog, but because it signals the end of the tender bedding plants for the year. When spring begins to warm up the soil, I notice it not just because the hat goes away, but because the bulbs are thrusting up through the soil. And when summer comes, I start not just to look at the soil, but to feel it, judging where the water is needed most. All of this is new to me. Listen, I'm a really impatient person. Lots of people will tell you that. And it does me so much good to be in a context where I cannot force the pace. It's out of my hands. I wonder, friends, is that a lesson you need to learn? Do you need to learn more about patience? I learned quite a bit about redemption too. I was blessed, or maybe not blessed, to have a father who was incredibly good at DIY, and I was a complete disaster at it, which meant that I don't ever really try it. Except in the garden, I've done all sorts of things. I kind of feel, well, if it goes wrong, it's only the dog and I who are going to see it, so why would it matter? So I've built a coffee table out of an old cable drum, and I've built a planter out of an old forklift pallet, and I've built a garden inside the seat of a broken chair. I even built a pond. That didn't go quite to plan, but it's working now. So all sorts of different things where I've had a go. Even made a water feature out of pots. You remember those little pots that you buy puddings in? From Puds & Co, or Pots & Co, sorry, made a water feature out of them with a fountain that bubbles up through it during the summer. So I've learned a lot about redeeming things which otherwise would be thrown away. Now, there is a place opposite my church where I work, which is very, very dangerous to me. It is an antique centre, a junk shop if you like, and it's almost impossible for me to go in there without buying something from it. Now, I went in there a couple of years ago. I didn't even have to go inside the shop, because outside it on the pavement was a lovely old rusty trunk with a bowed top. I decided to buy it and to plant it up. And the first year I had tall verbena at the back and geraniums cascading over the front. The next year I did a similar thing with a whole collection of geraniums and petunias. But right down at the bottom, in one of the drainage holes, was one persistent little weed poking out of the bottom. Again, a little quote for you. Without doubt, it is an imposter. It has no flowers and it does not belong. By rights, I should take a sharp pair of secateurs and cut it off before it attracts more attention away from the real flowers. The thing is, I can't quite bear to. There's something about that defiant little flower's pluck that I admire so much. Somewhere deep down in the damp darkness of that trunk, it has sprung to life. Not only that, but it has found a tiny hole through which it can escape into the light and flourish like any other plant. Who am I to cut it off? You know, every single one of us watching this tonight, bit like that weed, has been spared. We have been spared by the hand of God, and he has given us a second chance. I suppose I've learnt something about the continuum too. You know, one of the things about living in tied accommodation, as I do, accommodation provided by the church, is that it's not yours to keep. Lots of the longer term investment I have been putting into this garden, the shrubs that are taking years to mature, somebody else will benefit from them in years to come. One day, it says in the book, one day in the providence of God, I shall move on from this garden. Somebody else will watch as the sun moves on from the left-hand fence, slices the bottom fence in two at midday, and then bathes the right-hand fence in the golden glow of evening. Somebody else will see if the clematis survives another year, or the Virginia creeper succeeds with its attempt to swallow the decking whole. They will watch the frogs come and go in the pond, and savour the swishing of the meadow grass in a summer's breeze. It will be their garden then, at least for a little while, just as it has been mine for a while too. You know, all kingdom work is a relay race. All kingdom work is a work where we get to do part of it and then we pass it on to those who come after us. I wonder whether you sense that. I wonder whether you take it to heart. I'm finding my time in the garden makes me take it to heart all the more. You know, this is probably the longest book I've ever written. It certainly took the most effort. I may be good at words, I'm not very good at numbers. I was supposed to write 52 devotions in here. By the time I got to about number 49, I was really struggling. But I thought, no, come on, push on through and finish it. When I submitted it to my editor, the first thing she said was, you do realise you've written 54 of them, don't you? So I had to cut 2 out. Maybe they'll be there for volume 2. But you know, the longer it takes you to write a book, the harder it is to bring it to an end. This is how I chose to end this one. I wrote this: I hope there will be gardens in heaven, where I can labour for the pleasure of the one who planted them, and for my own too. From time to time I shall look up from the weeding, pleased that others enjoy the scents and colours as they go about their business. For those others, I hope there are libraries crammed with unread stories and laboratories fermenting with new discoveries of wonder. I hope there are oceans to cross and mountains to climb with an infinity of new possibilities to discover. When their journeys are done and their stories are read and their discoveries savoured, I hope there will be a garden in which to sit and watch the sun go down. I think there probably will be. Friends, may God bless you, and may God teach us all something from the world that is at our feet.